Okay, hey, we're live and we're on the new computer system. Hopefully people will notice a little bit of change in some of the things that I've done. I'm actually going to switch over to XSplit from OBS. I'm actually running a couple of different virtual things going on, which my old computer could have never done if my life depended on it, especially just even one video input overheated that thing. This thing is a monster. It can run anything. I could probably stream to Mars if I need to. So we have a really interesting discussion today. Tangel from the Atheist Experience Facebook group, the official Facebook group, had been talking to me the other day, and she wasn't too thrilled with some of the ways I present some of my arguments, which is fair. It's one of those hit or miss things. I do accept the fact that everybody has a different approach on how they talk about these topics, right? And I think when it comes to a pedagogical approach, that everybody has a different way of doing it. So no one size fits all. But I challenged her. And I said, well, if you don't really like my style, why don't you go try to explain some of these stuff into the Facebook group, the Atheist Experience Facebook group. And guess what? She did. And I gave her props. I was very impressed, actually. And so even though there were some maybe minor things that maybe weren't perfect, but I think it was the intent that counts. And so we were going to have a discussion with some of the things that she brought up in those posts on that group with Steven Hoyt and Ozymandias Ramses II. I'm sure not. He's not the first, but he's the second now. Were you ever the first? Was there a first? I don't know. I don't think.
Yeah, there would have been a Ramses the first. Yes.
Yeah, there would have been, but not you, because although I think your original incarnation on YouTube was completely different than you are now. Because I watched some of your older videos. Man, you've changed.
Really? I don't know how I've changed.
You've changed. No, I don't know. Just look different, sound different. You sound more confident. I don't know. Oh, and by the way, I will let you guys know. I'm running Zoom, and we have a 40-minute limit, and because I don't have the paid version. So this is going to end in 10 minutes, and then we're going to start another one. I'll give you the link real quick. I'll pop it over to you, Ozzy, and I'll pop it over to Tangel and Steven Hoyt. So let's get some introductions out of the way before we kind of get... they say the stream sound is kind of weird. It shouldn't be. This mic was all set up. Matter of fact, I tested it, and it sounded really good. So let me get a quick audio check, and let me know how you guys... if this is like decent for you, because Spaghetti says it's kind of wonky on his end. You guys can hear me fine in here, right?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, and everything I've done so far, I've tested it, and it sounded really, really good. So
I just listened to the live feed, and you were sounding clear to me. So.
Okay, we're just going to blame him then. He's making me paranoid. I got a new system, and obviously I want to make sure he's right on it, but he's making me paranoid. So let's get the introductions out of the way, and then we'll start the discussion after we come back in with a new link. So, Tangel, let's start with you, actually, since you're the kind of the guest of honor here. Give us a little background about yourself and how you got involved in this kind of discussion.
Well, I've been a member of the ASP for about 7 years now, I think, roughly. And I started modding about 2 years ago. So I've been seeing you pop in and out and cause all sorts of discord. And that's about it. That's my story.
That's kind of what I do. I have one job in life. It's to cause discord.
Indeed.
Yeah. And not on Discord, because I'm not a fan of Discord.
No, I don't get Discord either, but I have another mod who on that platform who insists that it's the best platform. Shout out to Douglas.
All right. Hoyt, we got Steven Hoyt. If you're talking about Discord, he also is somebody that lobs in hand grenades. He's like Steve McRae light. Okay, so.
Oh my God, I see the both of you, and I know I'm going to be busy.
Yeah, he's got a lot more hair than I do. No, I try and, if I start getting ornery with somebody, it's really trying to get them shaken up a bit so they're not comfortable, so that they want to think and that they want to take me on and then prove that they're right. And the more I'm an asshole sometimes, then the more they have to go. And if I'm a really good one, like I come with good reasons and logic and stuff, they actually have to do some work, and I want them to do some work, and sometimes that's the only way to get them motivated to do it. And then they find when they do their work, well, it wasn't so easy as when they first started arguing, and they're like, well, okay, yeah, I see your point now, and you're not a total idiot, but you're still an asshole. Well, I can agree with the asshole part, but that was not that wasn't my main intent anyway, is to get people to think. So that's kind of where I'm at. My background is, which started college back in '89, long time ago, as an art history major in computer science. But I went to liberal arts college, and so that was my introduction to philosophy, and I started studying it avidly then and for the next 30 years. And then last year, time and everything has allowed me to go back and get a degree in philosophy specifically. And I've only got a couple more classes. Things are going well, and then I'll enter into a postgrad and get a master's, and then maybe a PhD. I don't know.
Awesome. And Ozzy, do you really want to introduce yourself? I think everybody knows you by now, but
Yeah,
it's
I can be brief. My name is Ozymandias II. Everyone just calls me Ozzy for short. I'm a YouTuber. I make videos about the great debate, the question of the existence of God and that sort of thing, some counter-apologetics. My background is also in academic philosophy. I don't have a doctorate, but I stopped short of obtaining a doctorate. And my area of specialization was contemporary analytic epistemology, with a keen side interest in the philosophy of language and the philosophy of mind.
Those are some of my favorite parts of philosophy, by the way.
Well,
I definitely like.
Maybe I should have made it clear I don't have any education in philosophy at all. Zero, nada.
Well, I have no formal training either. I took one course in critical thinking and contemporary rhetoric, but other than that, everything I've learned is pretty much autodidactic. So we were kind of in the same boat there. That's why when you looked into this stuff, you looked at it, I think, from an objective point of view, and you looked at it from a non-biased point of view, because obviously we all know that there's a lot of talk about how words are being used in various communities, how it's used by the Atheist Experience, American Atheist, Atheist Republic, and I think most of my listeners by now have recognized that there are different usages to these words, and I know that Ozzy and myself and Hoyt and many other people have gone around and had a lot of discussions on that particular topic for a lot of years, going back to even the days of Magic Sandwich Show and GC Studios, the place. So this topic is something that probably will be around for a while. I do revisit it every so often, but I don't talk about it a heck of a lot, but as much as I used to, at least. I still talk about it a lot, but I was really fascinated by the fact that you took the time to kind of do your own research on this, came to the same conclusions that we've been saying for years. But then when you put it on the Facebook Atheist Experience page, you got a little pushback, the same pushback that we've gotten in the past. Did you notice the pushback that people were giving you was just the same kind of rhetoric that of people that have not taken the time to go look into these things?
I did, but it's always expected that people won't always read posts thoroughly. That's a phenomenon I think everybody experiences. You post something and they're just not read thoroughly. So few people caught on to the fact that I was making a distinction between general usage and usage in philosophy. That's pretty typical of a small number of repeat offenders.
Just real quick, I know you're on a phone. Is there any way you can actually increase your volume just a little bit?
Okay.
They can hear you, but I think it's a little unbalanced because you're on the phone and we're on microphones. Right. So it might. I'm gonna put voice meter on here so I can kind of do that manually next time, but I haven't gotten around to doing that yet.
Is that any better?
Yeah, I think. Well, it sounded good to me. It was the outside chat that I was concerned with. They were kind of saying that you were a little. So we'll ask them. Now I got about 3 minutes before we time out here. So do you want to start talking about this, or do you want to get a new link and just start fresh? Because we could take a 1 minute break.
New link and start fresh.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So give me just 1 second, guys. We'll be right back. I'm gonna give these guys a new link, and we're gonna get going on the topic. Here we go. All right, guys, we're starting to pop back in here, so give us 1 second here. I got to figure out why it's not showing my Zoom here like it was before, but I think I can fix that. So,
Testing.
yes, you're back in.
Great.
Let me just add another
Ceti, by the
source
way.
here. I haven't used this program in a very long time. It's not as easy to use as OBS, but it definitely is more powerful though. It also has more bugs, I think, too, though. It doesn't seem to be as smooth as OBS sometimes.
So before we start,
We're back live, by the way.
oh, okay, never mind.
Okay.
All right, am I back?
Yeah, but it's not showing. It's not showing the Zoom Hangout for some strange reason. But they can hear us.
Okay.
So how about? Well, I'm pretty sure they can hear us. Outside chat, can you guys hear us? If so, say hi. And while we're doing that, I'll get the video working, and they can continue with the discussion. Sound good? But I want to make sure they can hear us first. That's what the audio is more important than the video.
Yeah, they can hear us.
Okay, awesome. So, hey, Steven, why don't you kind of take it from here while I get the video working, and ask Tangel, tell people about the topic, especially the fact that, we've been trying to explain to people that the term atheism has various usages, and the usages that I particularly hold to and that I am more familiar with and that I've researched into the literature is completely different understanding what the ACA has as what they use the term for.
Yeah, well, let me segue into this, and Tanjil, you can maybe help with an understanding of the people that are in the group that you might be able to represent better than my casual experience. It's been really brief. One thing, the reason I engage in these kinds of things is it's a great topic as far as I'm concerned, because it has a lot of questions that kind of bugger philosophers and rules of inference and how to proceed and those kinds of things. That's what interests me about it. But I sit back in groups like that are all a majority of theists or all a majority of atheists, and I see a similar behavioral pattern develop, and I wanted to see if that's something that I can understand in terms of this problem, which I think when the reason why people want to identify as an atheist within your community seems to be important, and probably more important than is reasonable. For me, I have been in all kinds of discussions about theology and atheism and all this kind of stuff. And it's only been within the last year that this has become, in my mind, a live conversation that people are still having. For me, years ago, we don't even, in the circles that I run, we don't even care about that. We care about what people think, why they think it, and that sort of thing. But in your community, atheism and how people identify it seems to be very important. And from my perspective, it seems like it's to say that I don't have any ethical obligations whether I believe something or deny it. It's just somebody's saying something I disagree with, and I don't buy it. And for me, my concentration is kind of similar to Ozzy's in that it's analytical philosophy, particularly with epistemology, how we know things, how we justify things, and so on. So in my world, for doubt, you have to have a reason to doubt. And the example that I give in the Atheist Experience is, if someone comes to me with a sufficient amount of evidence to believe something, like vaccines do more harm than good, and they likely do no harm at all, or the theory of evolution, if I am presented with all the facts, how everything fits together and things like that, I do have an obligation, it seems to me, and seems to other people, that I have an obligation to justify my doubt. And so this seems to be an obligation that identifying a certain way and defining atheism a certain way, people think that gets rid of that obligation. And so I'll leave it to you from here to explain the people that you might be able to represent more than my casual understanding and introduction to you.
Sure, I do have an opinion on that. My opinion, obviously, not from the ACA. When people come to us, often they've been struggling with wanting to no longer identify as theists, and they're often confused, afraid of the word atheism, don't know how to answer apologetics within their own families and friends and communities. So I guess part of the technique is discussing very briefly burdens of proof to arm them. Now, these aren't sophisticated what should I say, arguments. These are people who are just very, very new. They're generally still involved with their theist families and communities, and they just need a very simple concept to be able to help them along. And so I guess that's what they give. I've always seen the AXP as a very entry-level introduction to atheism, which is very much needed. People who come in off the calls, I'm sure you've heard them on AXP, they are just completely unarmed. They have no idea how to answer to their families and friends. They don't know how to battle with the concept of putting burdens of proof onto this. Now, obviously, a great deal of our members have moved on from those basic introductory types of techniques, and they're the ones who are interested in the more philosophical side of things. But I think we still have a constant stream of new atheists who just need that basic introduction, who just get simply confused by the way that you and Steve might introduce those concepts.
Ozzy, what do you think about that? Because I mean, I understand what she's saying as far as wanting to normalize the term atheism. I get that, and I understand that it is an easy way for people to transition. Although I think that there's a somewhat of a disservice there, because I think that some theists would probably be able to transition through a series of steps rather than this all or nothing thing, by allowing to have like the position between of Gnosticism as a transitionary between theist and atheist, right? So I think that they kind of shoot themselves in the foot with that. But Ozzy, you've seen this before as well. I mean, her argument has merit, don't get me wrong, but do you think in the long run it actually holds as a viable way to if their agenda is to get people out of theism, is this the proper way to go, or is it a better way to go by explaining them how it actually is best understood in the literature and the academia, and then give people a better solid understanding of the philosophy, so when they do engage with these theists, they're not blindsided when a theist says, hey, well, you know, atheism is held to be the belief that God does not exist in all the literature. They're not coming back at them as some kind of very jejune type of a response.
Well, I actually liked what Tangel had to say. I think that shows like the Atheist Experience are, as she said, a necessity. They're a kind of a soft landing pad where people who are sort of in that state of disequilibrium when they lose their faith and then they find themselves in conflict with their friends, their family, coworkers, you know, everyone around them. They need some sort of concepts that are sort of ready to hand and not too nuanced initially. But I think it's important that people move beyond that. And I think that there is a trap that people fall into here. And the trap is this: when people lose their faith and they stop believing, okay, what they are non-believers, right? They are non-theists. They stop being theists. But the word atheism has been around for a long time. And for centuries in modern languages, it's been used to describe the position, the doctrine, that gods don't exist, that gods are bullshit. I'm one of those. I'm someone who thinks, like Matt Dillahunty and Aaron Ra, that all gods are made up, that they are all fictions. And we all go around saying things like gods are imaginary, gods are fictions, gods are make-believe, and stuff like that. Right now, of course, that is a position on the world. That is to say that you think that reality includes no gods. That is a claim about reality. And so that is a positive claim. Merely describing that as a lack of a belief in God mischaracterizes one's own position. So the problem that I have with this whole thing is not that people are not employing a term that is used in philosophy, and even broadly, not just in philosophy. If you just go out into the world and ask a person what an atheist is, they'll tell you it's someone who thinks there's no God. And if you ask people, you know, what's an agnostic, they'll say, well, it's someone who's on the fence, someone who's undecided, someone who's inconclusive, who can not make up his or her own mind about the question. And a theist is someone who believes there is a God, right? So even the ordinary vernacular usage aligns with the philosophical usage, but I don't care that the philosophical usage isn't what's being employed by people in the atheist movement. What I am concerned about is this idea that they don't have a burden of justification or a burden of proof. If you are making claims such as gods are inventions, gods are fictions, gods are made up, gods are imaginary, when you say things like that, what you are saying is that reality includes no gods. That's a claim about reality, and it makes no sense to, in the next breath, say that my position is rational, but it has no rationale. I don't need to defend it, right? So a position can't be rational unless there's a rationale for it. There has to be a reason. There has to be a justification for thinking that. And I'm effectively a lifelong atheist throughout all of my adulthood now. I think that it is not at all difficult to discharge the burden of justifying one's atheism. There are plenty of good reasons for thinking that gods are made up, right? That sense that most atheists have, that gods are made up, that they sound fictitious, they sound like fantasy, like bullshit from beginning to end. That is a justifiable intuition that they have. And most atheists, if you press them on them, will give you reasons why they think gods are imaginary, right? Even when they are just tumbling out of their faith, they are able to articulate what smells fishy about it, right? They might not be familiar with all of the apologetic moves and the counter-apologetic moves, that sort of the more highfalutin philosophical back and forth that has gone on for centuries over these questions. But I think that they can if they are encouraged to articulate it. So the worry that I have is this. Atheism as a movement is only worthwhile if it is a step in the direction of rationality and away from dogmatism. And if what we end up doing is saying, now you don't need to have any rational justification for thinking gods are made up, and you go around telling people things like it's not a positive claim, then you're going to brainwash people into thinking something that is in fact silly. And this is a message that I think that has been repeated ad nauseum for so long now that it has the character of a truism. It is practically a dogma among people in the atheist movement, such that when you suggest that, well, actually maybe you're not doing this right, maybe you're defining this incorrectly, maybe you're at odds with vernacular usage and you're at odds with philosophical usage, and maybe you are in fact encouraging people to think that a position that they hold isn't a position, and it has no burden of justification, when it is in fact, I think, fairly easy to discharge that burden. That I don't think is doing the atheist movement any favor. So that's the concern that I have. I'm speaking as an atheist myself when I say this. I'm not someone who's sort of on the fence. I'm not an agnostic. I'm not a theist. I have no leanings that way. So that's the concern that I have.
I think the confusion is nothing more than semantics. There wouldn't be an atheist who wouldn't be able to offer you reasons. They wouldn't call those reasons a burden of proof. They wouldn't call those reasons justification. It's just semantics about terminology. Language is a tool, not a weapon. And if you want to communicate with people, you use the language that they best understand. And you'll see that they do indeed follow the Socratic method of explaining and understanding their positions. They just might not use the same terminology. And that was my biggest beef with Steve, because everybody will argue, and they certainly did when I put it up, that's not called a burden of proof, that's just called a reason. So they understand that they've got to have that reason. They just highly object to the terminology.
Yeah, can I interject here just one thing? I've been saying for years that part of the problem is that the expression burden of proof makes people wet themselves when they hear it. It sounds like you are required to advance something that has the character of a geometrical proof, right? To establish the absolute impossibility of any and all gods. And that's not what that expression means. But it seems to me that people in the atheist movement ought to be leading they should be in the vanguard of advancing people's understanding of what that expression means. And it's nothing to be afraid of. It merely means presenting rational reasons for why you think that there aren't any gods. It's nothing more than that.
Yeah, and if somebody's going to be using the words differently, like, for example, I think the whole lexicon of the atheist movement in groups like Atheist Experience and American Atheism is their own. It's stipulative. It's very much something that they use to themselves, and you don't find pretty much anywhere else in the literature. Now, that's fine if they do that within the confines and the scope of their organization. But what happens is they tend to try to branch out to somebody like myself who's trying to read the literature and trying to explain the literature properly as best as I can, and then they say, "Well, you're just wrong, Steve," and that's where I think the disconnect is, because it's not that they are just using the words the way they want to. They're thinking that is how it's used ubiquitously. That they are thinking that these words are used that way and no other ways. And so when I come in and try to explain, a little bit more about details, or Ozzy does, or Hoyt does, they just shut that out. At that point, they're like, okay, you guys have no idea what you're talking about, because as Ozzy mentioned, they literally have been indoctrinated and brainwashed to think a very specific way. And anything that goes against that narrative is going to be shut out axiomatically. They're not going to even want to have a conversation at that point, because they're going to think that we're just practically wrong.
Yeah,
Steve,
well,
you do not try to understand and explain.
Oh,
You
I
have
do.
them with stand
I do.
perfectly.
Try to.
Sorry.
I have
You
for
have
6
them,
years,
and
trust
you say
me.
they're wrong, and you
Well-
attack them. You're a horrible, horrible man.
I'm a bad man. This is true, but for 6 years, I have definitely tried to explain.
You are terrible.
You haven't talked to Hoyt much, have you? Because I'm a puppy dog next to him.
Well, let me say the people that get my interest are the ones that it's the irony, I think, the amount of time that I've spent of my life devoted to this question. And I don't care if you're an atheist or a theist or whatever. I'm literally apathetic to any side. I'm as objective as anyone is going to get. And I've spent 30 years studying every angle, every argument from every position you can think of, no matter how people have defined themselves. And I allow people the breadth to define themselves. But when I say, hey, you can't say to this person X, Y, and Z because it's not the full picture. And then I say, here's what atheism also means. And they say, well, you just don't understand atheism. You don't understand atheism.
You're straw manning atheism.
Yes,
As they say.
every single piece of advice that I give is taken reactionally and emotionally that I'm somebody that wants to pee in their Cheerios. You know what I mean? I'm there to ruin their day. I'm an adversary. And really what I'm trying to advocate is here are all the things that you need to think about that you're not thinking about, and you're not being the whole thing about burden of proof is it's a conversational maxim where people are trying to be ethical in their conversations, and your part of it as a listener doesn't involve a burden of proof. It involves charity. And that's totally lacking in a lot of the conversations that I've had with people in the Atheist Experience Facebook group. But they're on the same side. I've had some great experiences and conversations, a few of them being with you and some other people that aren't like that at all. And I understand that that's the same way on the theist side. I've had, again, experience with everybody coming and going on that. But it just seems odd to me that you still find it in the place where people champion rationality and research and evidence and these sorts of things more than anybody. But it seems for some people, it's still the transition hasn't clicked over where it means the biggest part of becoming a non-theist, in my view, is that you become more rational, more interested in objectivity and leaving your bias behind and your hopes that something is right, leaving those aside so that you can actually have an honest, open inquiry, even if that means that may expose you back into reconsidering why it is that you left theism. But either way, you're either going to go back as somebody that believes it for better reasons or rejects it for even better reasons. But you can't just sit there with just very little reason your whole life and think that things are good and then demand that this is the way it is for everybody. That's just not a healthy intellectual life. And so my advice is when people tell you and can in some way show you that they're not ignorant of the topic, maybe give them the benefit of the doubt and listen and engage instead of saying you don't know what you're talking about, which to me, I scratch my head and I kind of have fun with those people and get their ire up. But
I totally agree with you. Look, I do understand that not everybody's going to study these topics, but there's something to be said for the charity. I see it firsthand that I'm not given much charity, right? There's been people that have been so conditioned to have Pavlovian type responses that when I tell them something that is actually demonstrable, that's logical, that's even citational, they have a cognitive dissonance in their head because they're looking at logic, which some of them actually understand it, and then they say, well, logic doesn't really explain anything. And so they don't give you the principle of charity that what I'm saying is something that's rational and is what's actually found typically in the literature and just worldwide. I think that a lot of atheists live in a very microcosm. But we have some super chats here I got to get to real quick. Kawasa, 2000W, my donation for 1 month of Zoom for Steve, and I probably will. I think I am going to probably get either Zoom or something. Again, I'm trying out different things before I settle on one. The Stone Apostate, $2. Shy it, but I'm late, but I am here. Better than not. And Brandon Livingston, I don't know who this person is, brand new to the channel, $400 super chat. Finally, a channel worth watching. I hope this helps to keep up the good work. Wow, thank you. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff in this channel. We got some good guests coming up. We're going to be doing a whole bunch of different variations of things. And so we're going to be practicing what we can get going on this channel after the whole other debacles going on in the community. So thank you for that. It means a lot. Like I said, I am on a new system. It's streaming a heck of a lot better. I'll be able to dual stream. I just got to figure out what software I want to use. But anyways, let's move on from there. So,
I'd
Tangel,
like to respond
yes, please.
to Stephen. Three things. One, when you present your ideas, that idea of charity might actually be something you could remember when you say, so you don't look stupid. So you two are a bastard. Secondly, oh no, I've lost my point. Steve, with your ad there, I can't remember what I was going to say. Oh, okay. What I was going to say was that you've simply chosen the philosophical use of these terms and declared them to be the best, and our members are declaring colloquial use to be the best. Now, that's really the debate we need to have.
And that's a good debate, but I think it's a little more I think it's a little bit more than that. I have a lot of experience with talking to people with the Atheist Experience. If that was the only case, that would be a fun discussion. But that's not what is being promoted. What they're saying is, no, Steve, you're wrong in all this. There's only one possible way you can define atheism, and that is merely not having a God belief. American Atheist has that right on their page about atheism.
But that's because you don't show. I've never seen you actually clarify that you're making a distinction between philosophical use and colloquial use.
I do frequently. Matter of fact, I have people that even condemn me for that because I tend to say this is the philosophical usage, and yet if you really want...
Well, I won't argue with that, but
if you really want to get in the nuances of it, I don't even think that the colloquial version is like merely lack of belief. I think colloquial is still the philosophical version, but I'm willing to make a distinction for a point of, just a simple arguendo. But if you actually look into the world, I think colloquially speaking, atheism is still a belief that God does not exist. But I'm using the term colloquial the way the Atheist Experience would use it in their microcosm. Now, other people might agree or disagree with that. That might be just me, my opinion. But when I talk to people on the street that don't follow any of this, they all have the same view that I do, that's what atheism is. I only find it among people that adhere to watching videos of the Atheist Experience or American Atheists. They're the ones that have that colloquial definition. But I don't really think that's the colloquial definition. It's the broadest. I'll give them that. It's the most sensu lato. But colloquial there might be an argument of what actually the colloquial definition is, but I just don't think it's an argument worth having, and so I'm really just to concede for the sake of the discussion that we're going to define the colloquial as what the Atheist Experience uses. But in reality, I might have an argument contrary to that, and I think Ozzy might as well.
Yeah, could I just step in on this? Well, first, just let me defend Steve here for a moment. He does, in fact, quite consistently and repeatedly distinguish between the philosophical definitions and colloquial definitions. And he's heard me actually take exception to this. I don't think that the colloquial definition, that is the vernacular definition, the definition that people employ out in the broader world outside of movement atheism, is any different from the philosophical definition. They are identical. It is, and that's why I think that the way to understand the definition that's used in the atheist movement is it's the activists' definition. It's the definition that activists favor, and they favor it because they think that by adopting this definition, it means that they don't have any burden of justification, and I think that's because they are under the misapprehension that burden of justification and burden of proof mean having to prove the absolute impossibility of any and all gods, right? Something like a geometric proof.
Exactly, yeah.
And that I think is a mistake. So I think the entire impetus or motivation for adopting the activist definition is misguided. It is born of an ignorance of some basic epistemology. But when people in the atheist movement repeat that this is what atheism is, I think they say this in part because they've heard it repeated so many times that, as I said, it has the character of a truism in their own minds. But if you're in that position and you think that is the one and only definition, the only suitable definition, or the only acceptable definition, and that there isn't another one out there really, and that it's only philosophers who have this weird, positive claim in their understanding of atheism, just ask yourself, why is it so necessary to constantly tell everybody that atheism is merely the lack of belief and isn't a positive claim? Why would atheists in the atheist movement constantly have to tell people this, except that that's what everybody already thinks? That is, in fact, the vernacular colloquial understanding of atheism, that it's the view that no gods exist. That's why... Right, what's that?
We can have our own colloquial...
You can have... Anybody can define anything. I mean, any movement can say, listen, we're going to define atheism a certain way, that's perfectly all right. And in fact, I think that what people in the atheist movement have done is adopted a definition of atheism that is actually the definition of the word non-theism. The concept in question is actually non-theism, and that's fine. I mean, if American atheists, would have named themselves American non-theists and included everybody in that umbrella, right? Agnostics and theological non-cognitivists, people who've never heard of a God, and, young children and all that stuff. That would have been great. I mean, then I think it would have been aptly named. Mm-hmm. But the problem that I have, again, is not, you've got a definition that's kind of eccentric and at odds with how everybody else seems to be using it in the word. That's not the problem. The problem is that the reason for adopting that definition is to avoid discharging a burden of justification, which makes us look ridiculous when we're talking with theists. Here we are telling theists, you need to defend the burden of your position. Meanwhile, we're saying, I don't have a position. Wait a minute, there's two positions in the room. And this is another misapprehension that people have, that there's only one burden of proof. Look, in a courtroom, there's one burden of proof, because that's the way we set up our court system. We set up our court system so that only the prosecution has a burden of justification or burden of proof. Right? We could have had a court system that didn't work that way, where the defense had a burden of justification, or both had a burden of justification or burden of proof. But we've set up our court system a certain way because we think that it's worse to convict an innocent person than to let a guilty person go. So we have stacked it a certain way. But rationally speaking, logically speaking, when people are having an argument, there are as many burdens of proof or as many burdens of justification in the room as there are positions being expressed in the room, right? Yeah. I have my burden, you have your burden. Steve has a different position than me. He's got his burden of justification as an agnostic. Theological non-cognitivists, they have a completely different positions, orthogonal to everything else on the question of God's existence. They have their reasons that they need to supply. So the concern that I have is this: if we're going to have a substantive conversation about, well, which definition ought we to employ, I think it behooves those of us in the atheist movement to say, we ought to have a definition that we adopt that isn't motivated by a misunderstanding of epistemology, makes us look like we're the burden shifters, not the theists, and doesn't betray a complete ignorance of certain basics in critical thinking and skepticism. This is, I think we undermine our own credibility as purveyors of rational thought and skepticism when we adopt this definition. That's the concern. In other words, I think it's a liability in the long run. In the short run, it's an easy definition for people who have just become disabused of their faith, but in the long run, I think it's
are you okay? I look like you just. I thought she took a header or something. I'm like, what the heck just happened?
No, just dropped my phone.
Yeah, don't be injured. Don't be injured on stream. That's not good.
But I'll let Steve.
I'm sorry. What, Tanjil?
Sorry.
Okay.
Can I piggyback on that just for a quick second? What I try and do when we get caught up in the labels is to take everybody's security blankets away and then just ask a general broad question, which is the important one that Ozzy is saying is getting forgotten. And that is, let's not worry about the labels. Let's say that we know for sure there are ways that people feel about a state of affairs. Do we feel like our reality is one that has a God, or do we feel like that we have the intuition that there isn't? We're not getting the impression that there are deity. That's a feeling, and that's associated with a certain kind of belief. But when it comes to a proposition, you have a different set of things that are going on. And that is to say, if I lack a belief in the one sense that I just said, I don't have an impression. I lack an impression of God's in the world. That's one thing. But when I approach somebody telling me that with a proposition, gods exist, I cannot say that I can't answer that proposition by saying I have a lack of a belief, because to answer that proposition means that I do have a belief about that proposition, regardless of whether it's to affirm, to deny, or withhold judgment. And each one of these requires some justification in order to do it. This is where I think it's important not to confuse, and I make a distinction that I admit Steve doesn't make, that Ozzy doesn't make, that other philosophers Malpass also do not make. I make a distinction that a burden of justification is not the same thing as burden of proof.
Burden of proof, yeah.
Everyone that is rational, that has a rational belief that can be justified, ought to justify it. That's an ethical statement. On top of that, it only comes into play that I have to give my justification when I do certain things. And that certain thing that I do that obligates me to explain my justification is called the burden of proof. That would be a distinction that I think is important, because in saying that, we can't play these games anymore that because I'm just denying something, I don't have to have a just reason for denying it. It's that I don't have there's nothing compelling me to give that reason for you. That's the difference between the burden of justification, or why it's important for me to say it's different to have a burden of proof versus having justification for what you believe. So anyway, if you take it as a proposition, data exists, you cannot be aware of it and address it without having some disposition. And as far as epistemology is concerned, every disposition, including being neutral, requires justification. So that would be how I generally try to pull the security blanket out from everybody and say, if we're going to have this conversation, and if ethics of conversations matter, then not only are we going to discuss when I say something as being a fact of the matter, that I have a burden of proof, which is to disclose my justification, that if I simply ask you, you haven't even prompted any reason for me to want to, you don't have any burden of proof for me. But if I just inquire to you, why is it that you doubt what I'm saying? Then as an ethical conversation, participant in an ethical discussion, you ought to disclose your reasons for saying what you say. Yeah. So that's what
Real quick, I would say that, again, people do understand that they need to have a good reason. They just don't necessarily relate to the terminology that you use. And I guess part of the reason we've got to the point of saying, and this is only a guess really, I mean, I can only look at the evolution of the way it's been used and make my best guess. But I guess, put yourself into the shoes of, a 16-year-old atheist in a fundamental or evangelical family. If they're hammering them saying, why don't you believe? Why don't you believe? If that child is given the tool to say, well, look, it's your claim. You prove to me that your God exists. That's a really handy claim. It deflects the conversation. It stops the hammering by their family, etc. So, and really, it's just I guess it's a shortcut. It says, well, I'm an atheist, but the burden of proof is on you to convince me. So, yes, they are saying they don't believe by nature of identifying as an atheist, and by saying, look, literally, I'm just rejecting your claim. It's a contracted version of, I don't believe, it's up to you to convince me.
Let me say two things real quick. It's so funny because Hoyt and I probably agree on more than we think we agree on. I think the vernacular is different, as you said. Look, what he's talking about, I call the burden of persuasion. Burden of persuasion is a very specific type of burden of proof. There's in legal terms, there's a burden of persuasion and burden of production. The burden of production is what's required in order to bring something to trial, and the burden of persuasion is what you need to do to convince the jury or the judge of of the person's guilt. What the prosecuting attorney would be, or in a civil litigation, that you have a better case than the other person. But there's still a form of burden of proof, because burden of proof, to me, I still don't see any distinction between a burden of proof, burden of justification, and burden of evidence. To me, they're equivalent terms, in epistemology at least. Now, legally, there might be some nuance, but I don't know why Hoyt is the outlier on this, and I really like for him to give me a distinction between what he considers to be a burden of proof and a burden of justification, if they're both epistemically what reasons we have to hold a position.
I agree with him. It's less confusing.
Well, put it this way: one of them.
I don't agree with him it might be less confusing, but that doesn't make it.
It's about who you owe what to and when. Everybody, all the time, that has a rational belief ought to justify their belief. That's always in play. But that is an epistemological thing. This is the context where that plays out. Burden of proof is a contextual matter, and it only plays out in conversations. It says when you disrupt a conversation and only when you disrupt a conversation with stating something as fact that's disputed, that is when you bear the burden of proof. So that's the distinction I'm making, and it's also one that I think matters because it leads to what we've all experienced, where people say, "Oh, theism is a claim." Well, no, it's not a claim at all. It's a propensity to believe something.
I don't see the distinction.
Well, okay, if I have a belief and I tell you I am a theist, I'm telling you something about me in relation to theism. I'm not giving a proposition about the world that theism is true. I'm telling you how I relate to that.
But you are.
I completely disagree.
I disagree. I totally disagree with you too.
Well, okay,
you are giving. That's exactly what you're doing by saying that.
Can I just say this is an orthogonal debate. This is really at 90.
This is the stuff I like, though. This is the.
No. This is a conversation I'd like to have with Steven Hoyt, actually, because he posted something about this on Facebook the other day, and I wasn't able to reply, and I was intrigued by it, and I thought, oh yeah, and I think you tagged me in it. I think that's how I noticed it, the thread. So this is a conversation I'd be interested in having with him. But I really think that it's going to take us into
let's save that for a part 2. Obviously, we're going to be doing more of these things.
Can I say something to Tangel, though? I want to thank you for introducing something to me that as soon as you said it, it was like, oh, geez, how did I not recognize this before? It's so obviously right. When you said that the terminology that we're using, expressions like burden of proof, burden of justification, might seem kind of scary and unfamiliar, and perhaps too demanding for people. But the average atheist will give you reasons why they think that there's no God, or why they are so skeptical of theistic claims, right? And I don't know why I never thought of it in such simplistic terms, but it's very obviously correct. So thank you for pointing that out. In hindsight, I realized, geez, yeah, of course, that would be a better way for me to express what I think is called for here. Thanks for that. And I was talking about motivation earlier, and what I think is sort of an unfortunate motivation that attracts people in the atheist movement to this particular lack theist definition of atheism. And let me say something about my own motivations and why I have sort of challenged this and opposed this for a number of years now. And it's this. I want people who don't believe to be able to articulate the reasons why they think there's no God. I think if you're part of the atheist movement, you really ought to be championing reasons why you think gods are made up. And I think such arguments exist, and there are good reasons to believe such arguments. I think it's a completely defensible position, and I would like to see the positive case for atheism being made, as opposed to this burden-shifting move of, no, I'm not going to explain why I think there are no gods. In fact, I'm not even going to go so far as to say I think there are no gods. But in the next breath, I'll say gods are bullshit, gods are made up, gods are fictions, gods are imaginary, and so forth, right? So instead of doing this kind of two-faced move and burden-shifting, which is the very thing that we accuse theists of doing all the time when we see them do it, I think that people in the atheist movement need to champion arguments for atheism. And so it's okay sort of in a landing pad when you're sort of, as you said, 16 years old, you've becoming disabused of your faith, and you need to sort of, stave off the onslaught of your family and friends and neighbors and so forth. That's all well and good, but at some point one has to graduate beyond that. And I think as a movement, if you want to sell and promote atheism as a more realistic view of reality, then people have to become more practiced in expressing why they think there are no gods. These arguments need to be as rehearsed as this definition that atheism is a lack of belief. And if those reasons for thinking that religions are made up were more commonly articulated and not shied away from and avoided it like the plague, then I think this is a movement that would have more teeth.
We're gonna be kicked out.
That's my motive,
so
anyway.
We're gonna go on standby here for another 1 minute. You guys go to some drink, because the Zoom only has a 40-minute thing. So again, I'll probably just go ahead and get Zoom at some point if that's what we're gonna stick with. But go ahead and take a break real quick. We'll be back in like 1 minute. All right, we're already starting to come back here. I'm going to have to, I guess, make a new thing here. So let me do that real quick. And I should have this down in art form eventually. So I think that's going to do it. There we go. And we're back, or at least some of us are back. So luckily, I got everybody the link at the same time, so it was pretty quick. And we'll probably be done in 40 minutes, so it'll probably be the last time we have to do that. We're just waiting on Ozzy.
To complement what Ozzy was saying, Tangel, if anyone needs help with some really good things to say about religion, I will be happy to help them craft their arguments or think through what the difficult aspects are, like the really good things to criticize religion for on a
sure, that would be a great topic to raise.
Yeah, I've done that as well. I was going to do a blog on that, taking a bunch of arguments and say, look at as an agnostic, I can still make very good arguments for atheism. And if I could do it as agnostic, I sure the hell know that an atheist can do it. And what I do is I use a somewhat of a carrier type approach, but not using Bayesian, but a probabilistic approach using all the arguments that I have compiled over some time against various types of gods: logical problem of evil, evidential problem of evil, divine hiddenness, liar's paradox. There's a whole bunch of God. I mean, Ozzy has his these attributes or properties of a deity seem very reminiscent of what you would find for any kind of superhero or mythological creature. So anything that is in that category, that class, that set of things that sound mythological, probably more likely the case that any god that's going to be posited would also be in that set too. You can make these types of probabilistic arguments. That, to me, would more than make somebody's burden of proof. Of either.
Well, that's a much more positive way of going about it than
sure.
jumping in saying, well, it's a burden of proof, and that's, you're an idiot if you don't. Yeah, that would make much more sense.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why it really is disconcerting when I see atheists say, well, we don't have a burden of proof at all. Now, if they want to argue that as a lack theist, atheist, a person who just doesn't believe, if they want to argue that doesn't have a burden of proof, that at least is something we can have discussions with. I can actually bring to the table, what Dr. Martin has written about this, on negative atheism, what Carrie has written about this, and a lot of other people that agree that even that has some form of burden of proof. Dr. Malik, Dr. Malpass, a lot of them have written on that.
I don't think they're not denying a burden of proof. They're not relating to the term burden of proof. As
that might be true. That might be true.
Everybody understands why they don't agree, and we actually have quite a few posts with people saying, well, why don't you believe? And people will list all their reasons. So they certainly have plenty of reasons. They just don't relate to. Do
you think it'd be better if they did call the burden of proof, though? Let's hypothetically go down that line.
No.
See, this is why. Look at let me give my argument on it, and then Hoyt can. Look, I agree with
Team Hoyt.
I agree.
Yeah, I've had so much success with that distinction this week that's why I think it's important, because when you say something, you have a burden, and they don't feel they have a burden because they're not saying anything.
Well, they have a burden. Well, look at that. No, they still have a burden. Okay, I mean, you can call it a burden of proof or a burden of justification. It's a burden to be had either way. To be rational, you have that burden, right?
When does it come into play, and who do you owe it to? That's the question. That's why the distinction.
I think you owe it to yourself.
Yeah,
you owe it to yourself as a
I believe
rational
it.
agent.
Yeah, if I believe something to be true, I have that burden to myself. Whether you
yes, but that doesn't mean when I have a belief, I walk into a room and suddenly I have a burden to you to say, hey, listen, I'm an atheist.
That's where I think you get confused, though. This is where I diverge with you.
That's a discursive. That's a discursive burden. It's not a rational burden.
That's correct. That's correct. That's exactly what I'm saying.
But nobody's arguing that.
You do believe in God. Hey, you don't believe there are no gods. You do believe there are gods, and you're just angry at God.
Well, hang on. If I say to Ozzy, hey, Ozzy, I believe all gods are bullshit, and he says, well, you now have a burden to me to demonstrate that or to show me or give you all your evidence, I could tell him to piss right off. I'm like, I don't owe you anything, and I think that's what you're trying to say. Just because I make a statement to somebody, I don't think you necessarily have an onus to have a discussion with them.
When you make a statement about the world, then you bear it to a public. That's what you're trying to tell somebody is this is the way things are. And you have a burden, just an ethical. It's not somebody's going to come up and shoot you if you don't oblige, but you have
But that's contingent on the person you're talking to. If Ozzy is a piece of crap and I don't want to deal with him, and I just say, look, this is my belief, and I'm just doing some kind of self-assessment, I don't have any onus to sit there for 4 hours and tell him why I believe the positions that I have. I just don't.
Well, there's a difference between saying I believe this is the case and this is the case, and that might be another distinction.
I think they're synonymous. I think when you're saying I believe it to be the case, you are saying it is the case. In a deflationary way of putting it, if I say it is true that the snow is white, you're saying the snow is white. It is deflationary at that point, right? So when I say that if I say I believe God exists, you are making the claim. Is this ontologically speaking that God exists? What's the difference there?
No, it's not, because the proposition is God exists. I am outside of that proposition. When I say I believe God exists, I'm telling you my disposition towards the truth of that proposition itself.
I think that's bewitchment by language. When I say, this is a cup, and I say I believe this is a cup, in both cases, I am affirming the proposition, this is a cup.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
In one case, so in other words, when you are in the business of believing something, when you believe something to be true, okay, you are affirming the veracity of that proposition, right? You just don't have to preface every belief state that you express with the words I believe.
Right.
If I say to you, I'm going to be at the airport to pick you up, that's a promise. I don't have to start by saying, I promise I'll be at the airport to pick you up. And I can order you. I can say, get out. I don't have to say, I order you to get out. And it's exactly the same thing. These are all speech acts. There are directive speech acts like get out, or I order you to get out. That's just an explicit directive. And I can promise you something, and I can make the promise explicit by saying, I promise, or I swear. And similarly, I can assert something like there is a God, or there is no God, or this is a cup. And I can preface that assertion by expressing the kind of speech act that I'm making, namely an assertion, by saying, I believe. It's exactly the same. So I think the point is the content. The point is the content of the speech act, okay, can't be divorced from the speech act, right?
It can have more than one intent. And I'll give you an example that I think I defended R&R against both you and Stephen before. When someone says, there is a God, I argued for Aaron, saying that his reply to that statement by saying there are no gods is the equivalent to saying, no, I don't believe it. And it's the perlocution. It's why you say something. You can't just take the words and say that I believe this proposition and conclude from that what my intent was. So if I say that I believe P, my burden is to first of all, recognize what it is I'm trying to convey. And if I'm trying to tell you how my disposition, my psychological state, how I'm taking this proposition to be, that's a disclosure. It's not an assertion. It's a very clear distinction that's made in speech.
It's a disclosure of what you affirm to be the case.
Right.
Yes,
You're telling
is a proposition.
Yes.
But here's the thing that I want you to consider. My assertion is about my relationship to P. It's not about whether or not P is true or false.
You are affirming it to be true, though. That's I don't. You're making these weird distinctions that I don't.
No, just because you.
No, it's about the burden. Do I have a burden to prove P? When all I want you to know in my saying something at all is that I believe it's true. I'm telling you what I believe.
Look, if someone says, Ozzy, do you believe there's a God? And I say, I don't believe there's a God. Okay, or I believe there are no gods. Now, that's not a claim about reality. Of course it is. But no, it's purely autobiographical. I just said, I believe. I'm just talking about me. I'm not talking about reality. No, when I say I believe, I'm making the autobiographical claim that this person thinks there aren't any gods, right? That is a claim about reality, and it is a claim about myself. It isn't one or the other. It's like, let me give you a parallel example. If I walked up to you and I said, do you know what time it is? And you said, yep, and walked away, you'd be a jerk because I asked you a question, but my question was not actually, do you have the time? It was, please tell me the time. In other words, do you have the time is actually a directive. It's tell me the time. It's not actually a concern about whether or not you know what time it is, and I'll be satisfied with a yes or a no, or I don't know, and have you walk away, right? And that's how speech acts work, right? And so when a person says there's no God, or I don't believe that there's a God, or I believe there's no God. I mean, supposing you say, hey, Ozzy, do you believe that in Bigfoot? And I said, I don't believe a word of that. That's not expressing lack of belief. That's expressing a lot more than lack of belief. That's expressing the view that I think is bullshit. It's just Bigfoot's just made up.
But it's about what the obligation.
That is a claim. I am making a claim about reality. I am making a claim about myself. I'm expressing my psychological state, my doxastic state about a proposition. And that proposition is what bestows a rational burden of justification upon me. And just because I preface a proposition with I believe doesn't get me out of any burden of justification that I have, because the burden of justification is a condition of rationality on any rational agent.
Unless, and let me give you an example from the SEP. In reviewing, I wanted to review all the different ways philosophy looks at this question that we're dealing with here. And it's very clear if you look at in the SEP why there is a definitional problem with atheism being defined as in terms of belief. They make the same distinction I'm making with you, that there is a doxastic propensity that one may have or may not have that is distinct from the proposition deity exists. And the only way that you can approach the question, which is why there is an obligation at all on anyone that approaches the conversation, meaning you have to have knowledge of the proposition, and two, you have to be, once you have knowledge of it, you understand all the terms and all the concepts that are relevant to you, to it, you have a propositional attitude, which is different from your doxastic. And the reason why you're an atheist is because you're approaching a proposition that's either true or false if you take that proposition.
But you're taking a doxastic stance on it.
No, you're not.
Well, you are.
The distinction that they're making is that you don't lack a belief about that proposition. You may not have.
I may. Well, hang on. No, because if I I could be an agnostic and lack a belief on the proposition being true or false. That is a second order belief, right? If a first order belief is going to be something on the proposition itself, saying that the proposition is either true or false, if I take a stance on that, if I suspend judgment on that, that will be a doxastic position, but it's a second order doxastic position because it's not actually taking a direct position with respect to the proposition. It's not saying it's true, it's not saying it's false. It's, like you said, epistemically suspending judgment. You can believe, disbelieve, or you can suspend judgment on it. But that still is, in my opinion, a doxastic position. I mean, agnosticism is a belief. It's a belief that you're just not justified to say the proposition of God exists is true or false. Is if you really want to just make it very simple. Anybody?
I would agree with that. Can I turn back to?
Yeah, we got to bring it back a little bit to her. So, please.
So one thing I might recommend to you, and tell me what you think of this. The expression, I've been saying this for years now, so people are going to be tired of hearing me say it one more time, but you haven't heard me say it, so here it goes. I don't think that there is a meaningful distinction to be made between burden of proof and burden of justification. Okay, I mean, you can try to talk about discursive burdens and burden of persuasion and stuff like that, but the rational burden of justification, right? That's what we're concerned about, right? What the reasons here, right? If I've been saying for years, stop using the expression burden of proof. It makes people wet themselves. They think they need something like a geometric proof of the impossibility of any and all gods, right? And now no one has that burden unless that's what they think is the case, that they can demonstrate that any and all gods are impossibilities, right? I don't think that that's true, so I don't try to discharge that burden, right? But I think I have good reasons for thinking that any and all gods are made up. I can't demonstrate that they're all impossibilities. I think some gods are self-contradictory, and so those are impossibilities. But not all gods are impossibilities. I just think that they're all false, and I have reasons for thinking why they're all false, why they're all inventions. So I've been encouraging people for years, stop talking about burden of proof. Just use the expression burden of justification, because justification is more closely tied in people's understanding to the idea of having reasons and the giving of reasons. And I think atheism is a perfectly reasonable position, but it can only be reasonable if you have reasons. And so I think it's important that we give those reasons and that we rehearse those reasons, and that atheists sort of graduate from that welcoming stage and that initial landing pad, and at some point graduate from simply deflecting and asking other people to defend their view, and then maybe able to divest those arguments coming from theists, to actually giving reasons why you think that none of this makes any sense, and it's more rational to think it doesn't exist. I mean, let me give you a really simple argument. It's not an argument that I would advance myself, but a simple argument that I think many atheists implicitly have, but seldom articulate. But they sometimes they betray it in their speech, right? Aaron Ra, I think, notably falls into this sometimes. If you are a metaphysical naturalist, if you think that everything in the world is natural and you think gods aren't natural, if you think reality is exhausted by the concept of natural, right, then if you have reasons for your naturalism, that's a reason for your atheism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because if naturalism is true, then they ain't no gods.
Yeah, it has to entail atheism.
Right.
And this
so now that there is an argument. Now, that a lot of atheists are committed metaphysical, scientific naturalists, right? I'm not one of those, but many of them are. Those people just need to articulate the reasons for their naturalism, right? And if you sort of, press them in a kind of Q&A, if you interrogate them a bit, it'll come out. But too few atheists will ever bother to do that, right? But they'll sometimes contradict themselves. They'll say, well, no, I would never want to say that gods are impossible. But in the next breath, they'll say, anything that exists is natural, and if we discovered a god, it too would be part of the natural world. Well, there you go. Now,
well, there's also the fact that I've seen.
You are a naturalist, you just don't want to call yourself one, right? So if you are a naturalist and you have reasons for your naturalism, that's a reason for your atheism.
Real quick, Ozzy. So I've seen people do this, and I'm sorry, I've seen Aaron do it more than one occasion. He just did it the other day. He'll say something along the lines of, "I don't believe God exists." I'm not saying I don't believe God doesn't exist, but then later on, he'll say things like, gods are bullshit. He'll say, all gods are made up. He'll make comments that obviously will. To anybody listening will give the impression that he believes that there are no gods. In public and private, he has said that he believes there are no gods. Yet when it comes to these types of topics, and other people do the same thing from the Atheist Experience, they probably do hold the belief that there are no gods, but then they retreat right back into, oh, well, I just merely saying for this argument that I'm not believing. And they go back to that 16-year-old that's putting some pushback to their parents as, oh, you need to prove it to us. But these people are well beyond that 16-year-old soft landing. They're well beyond it, and they're having these conversations, and they're making these statements, and they don't want to have to take the responsibility of providing the evidence, the citations, the reason, the logic, and all that stuff.
No, I completely disagree.
I see it daily. I see it daily.
If you ask them if you simply ask, what is your reason, you will get the response. When you talk about burden of proof, that's when the confusion comes in. They all do have their reasons. But
well, that's probably true,
we could arm
but
them with some good reasons.
I think they do have their reasons, but but some of the reasons are pretty bad.
Well, then maybe there's a...
Well,
look, it might be, but people do know why they don't believe. There wouldn't be a single person there that said, well, I don't know. But Ozzy's right. Putting up some more sophisticated responses to the question would probably be a really good way to add to their toolkit.
Sure.
Yeah, it wouldn't even bother me if people advanced arguments for atheism that are fallacious, okay? Because the fallacies in those arguments will be exposed, and they can disabuse them themselves. One of the things that I devoted my channel to, I made a number of videos trying to disabuse atheists of some really bad counter-apologetics, because if you have a bad counter-apologetic, you end up looking ridiculous and you discredit yourself, right? So, I mean, to my mind, it would be sort of a step in the right direction if a lot of atheists who try to avoid the burden of justification would just try out some of their actual reasons, and if they find out that some of those arguments don't hold up and they have to divest themselves of those arguments, then that's fine. They either change their mind or find better reasons. But that would be a step in the direction of taking people in the atheist movement and getting them in the direction of having more robust arguments, because bad apologetics makes religious people look ridiculous, and bad counter-apologetics make those of us who are atheists look ridiculous.
I agree.
And so I would like to see people moving in that direction, but they're not going to move in that direction as long as they're being told ad nauseum need never give a reason for why you think there isn't a God. In fact, you should never admit that.
Well, I was
when it slips out, you should
reading Richard Carrier, who talks about priors, and he feels quite strongly that the prior is very low for the existence of gods. Therefore, it's up to theists to add something new to actually establish that there could be a God. So
Right.
if we went by Richard Carrier's explanation of priors, then in fact we are in exactly that position. We don't even have to answer to you.
Well, yes,
You've done
yes.
nothing to
No,
add
it's,
to your
that's
prior.
that's where I think Carrier jumps the shark. I do agree with.
Yeah.
I think he overuses Bayesian probability. I agree with low priors, but Bayesian is more for analysis of certain things. It's not for this post hoc analysis that he uses it for history. I've never seen it used for historical context before, but. You can't just say, look, the work has already been done. It's not like a scientific theory, right? When it comes to like general relativity or evolution, I think there's something to be said. It's somebody who doesn't know about the topic and say, look, these scientific theories, you have the onus to disprove them. I don't think I have to just show somebody that the theory is valid. Okay, I can, but the onus is on, in science at least, the onus is upon the person to disprove the scientific theory. I get that. But in philosophy, it doesn't work that way, right? So you're having a dialectic with somebody. You're having a discussion with somebody. You can't just rest on your laurels and say, well, you know what? The work's already been done. Therefore, I don't have any reasons to give you or need to give you any reasons about why I'm holding particular positions. I think that's lazy. And I think that's what Carrie's advocating.
I mean, well, what have they had in 2,000 years? They have not had one progression on...
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the individual. The individual may or may not know what's out there. They have to justify their belief. They can't just say, well, in 2,000 years we haven't had this evidence. They need to at least give some positive reasons, I think, of why they hold a particular position. But that takes a little bit of time. And
would withhold that. But
And also...
Real quick, we're running out of time. I got some super chats here. I knew this was going to go long. Let me just read this real quick. Mark Thompson says, for $5, Steve, I know you're agnostic, but do you still consider yourself an anti-theist? I recall you describing yourself as such a year ago on NS. No, what I said was, there's certain religions I am anti-theistic to. I've never labeled myself an anti-theist ever. There's just a couple religions that I'm now leaning toward anti-theism only because of the atrocities that have been happening in those churches. It's hard not to be anti-theistic for a church that covers up these types of crimes. I mean, to me, it's no different than some kind of a business that is doing illegal practices and covering it up. And so, if you want to label that as anti-theistic, sure. But I'm not an anti-theistic toward religion or God concept in general, no. Odeon 14, denominations within the non-theist church. Ansgard, I hate his last name. Ansgard Odinson. There we go. I got it right, buddy. He says, this is everything non-sec lost. Love that is back. Thank you. We appreciate that. I don't know how much time we have left in this particular hangout. I don't want to start another one. So I think we made it wrap it up, and we could do another part 2 and part 3. This is an ongoing discussion, and what I noticed is that you talk about one thing, it leads to 5 other things. But Tanjil, I do want to give you the floor a little bit of how you want to go about approaching the people in your communities and on Facebook to explain to them the things that we're talking about, and maybe move them away from this, oh, we're all wrong here, to, oh, we're just using things differently, which you have done. You had in your post basically explaining, look, these guys over here talking all about philosophy, they're not wrong. It's just they're using terminology that you might not be familiarized with. So if that's the case, then if they were to understand what we're saying and familiarize with it, they don't necessarily have to use these terms that way, but it would alleviate a lot of the contention of them saying, oh, well, yeah, you know that Steve McRae guy, he's just hosed as hell. I mean, he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Because that ends up leading to a little bit of discord. Do that to Steven Hoyt, and he's gonna go ballistic. I mean...
No, he won't. I'll smack him.
Well, listen,
that's what I do to him, too.
It really helps, and I think if you go through all the conversations that I've been involved with, you'll know that objectively when I say that I'm not there to be a dick to anybody, and really the only people that I have problems with are the people that tell me I'm wrong, or that you just don't know what you're talking about, or you're stupid, whatever. Those are the kind of reactionary people that I'll typically be an asshole to.
Yeah, no, I don't mind somebody saying you're wrong. What I get is, okay, if I'm wrong, show me why, and they break out a dictionary, and I'm like, I'm not going back to second grade, man.
It's not even that.
It bugs me. If they can't give me a citational paper that they read, and what's worse is when they say, well, I've never read anything about this. I've never read any papers. I don't like the subject. Philosophy is all garbage. And then they say, but you're wrong. I'm like, that doesn't really give me much concern of your opinion, that you're telling me I'm wrong on a topic that you self-admit you have never done any reading on whatsoever.
Yeah, and that's not so much.
Go ahead, Ozzy. What?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Helena Handbasket in the live chat early on when we started said, can we raise a question about the weaponization of philosophy in this discussion? Because that is a concern that she has, a concern that I have. There is a danger here. If you go around saying, well, look, in philosophy, it's like this, and you're just a philosophical ignoramus, right? Well, you're not going to sort of, win friends and influence people that way. And I think what you're going to do is you're sort of going to encourage people to disregard the philosophy. Because if they think, look, I've been told ad nauseum that atheism is this, it's the lack of belief, it's lack-theism, okay? And then somebody comes along and says, well, in philosophy, it's like this. Oh, well, so much the worse for philosophers and philosophy. What the hell do they know? And you get dismissed. And I think that actually you run the risk of getting people to disregard philosophy. And there's already a kind of anti-philosophical prejudice within the atheist movement, because a lot of people in the atheist movement are science boosters. And they have this sort of weird Lawrence Krauss, Stephen Hawking idea that philosophy is just some kind of theology. It's just speculating. It's what Oprah Winfrey does. It's just speculating out of your ass, from your armchair without consulting the world. It's not at all what goes on in analytic philosophy or contemporary philosophy generally. But that's what people imagine that it is, that it's just speculating, right? Because, whenever someone just starts speculating, that we say, oh, well, they're getting philosophical, okay? But that's like saying, I don't believe in climate change, and that therefore I'm a skeptic. I have doubts about something.
You make a good point.
Skepticism isn't just doubting, and speculation isn't philosophy. And there's a danger here of using philosophy and citations and papers as a kind of bludgeon.
No, and you make a good point. And so let me push back on this a little bit. Why do we not have the same standard that we do for like biology? If we're talking about evolution, and we're talking about things that a creationist is going to bring up, and we say, okay, well, you want to talk about human chromosome number 2 fusion. Okay, here's my citations for that. Oh, and then the other person says, well, you know what? I know nothing about biology. I have no paperwork. I think giving them a pass in philosophy is the same thing as just saying to a creationist, well, the fact that you have no evidence, you have no papers, you have nothing, that you don't even know about the topic. To me, it's about the same thing. But I understand what you're saying. Well, let me finish. I think it's I think, like I said from the very beginning, there's different ways to go about a pedagogical approach to these things. And I don't think it's one size fits all. And I don't disagree with what you're saying. I do not. Let me go on record. I think that you make very valid points. But being in the trenches, like Stephen and I, we're really in the trenches with a lot of these stuff, and we see a lot of people that I would put have no interest really to learn this stuff. They are the base level trolls. I don't have the time or the patience for those. And yes, I may get a little testy with them, and Steve's pretty much the same way. But those are not the ones that we're really trying to address. The ones that really want to learn, the ones that come to me and say, "Hey, Steve, I don't understand this. Will you please help me?" I'll spend 3 hours of my own time off air in messages helping people. I'm sure many of them are in the live chat right now. That's the people we're trying to reach. But those aren't the ones that we'll get that way with. Does that make sense, Ozzy? I mean, I know you probably don't agree, but I hope you at least kind of see where we're coming from.
Yeah, it does. But I think that there's it's just
you might be right. I mean,
like honey and vinegar thing. Sure. What attracts more flies, right?
Sure.
When it comes to sort of
both
friends and
like
influence,
polarized, I'm afraid.
It's our charm. It's just our natural charm. That's all. Don't hate the player. Hate the game.
There's a disanalogy, though, Steve. There's a disanalogy with what you were saying. Yes, it's true. If we're having a disagreement about some scientific facts, then yes, bring out the citations, bring out the papers, and stuff like that. But if you're arguing with an atheist who poo-poos and dismisses philosophy and thinks that there's nothing to it, it's just speculation or something like that, divorced from reality, uncoupled from the facts, and it's something. They have that kind of prejudiced, stereotypical view of philosophy, which I think is an uninformed view of philosophy. Then when you say, well, go and find me a paper by a philosopher that says it, they're just going to say, listen, like the emperor has no clothes. I'm not going to waste my time, right? There's all that is.
But is that kind of telling, though? I mean, it's a shame because I mean, I at least do.
But they think it's a pseudo. They think it's
I know they do.
I think it's a pseudo discipline. It'd be like you saying, well, find me an astrologer that
Right.
that agrees with you. Like.
No, I get that, and you're absolutely right. That is what they do think. They think that it's. I'm asking them for like metallurgy, like to find go find a paper that can transmute gold, lead into gold.
I know the problem. The problem is you guys are amateur assholes. I don't just.
He's professional. This guy, yeah. You think I'm bad? You haven't met him.
I try to help people. I say, here is where you can find the gloves and the trunks and how to get in the ring. And what I proceed to do is take the ideas that come from philosophy and utterly destroy what they thought was good reasoning with good reasoning. That's the difference. I will absolutely beat somebody up as much as I can with good reason.
Yeah, you
And
do.
if nobody understands that they're being beaten up, have they actually been beaten up?
Right.
that's true. They don't realize they got their ass handed to them. No, I agree with you on that.
I try to make it clear.
Fair point. Hoyt wants them to know when they've had their ass beat. He trusts me.
They don't.
In an argument, you should.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Tanjil.
I was just going to say, my takeaway from this is that I haven't changed much from my original position, and that was use language as a tool, not a weapon. Trying to find the lingua franca and try and meet in the middle somewhere. I think that most people understand that they have reasons for atheism and can certainly express those when asked. It's just the terminology. But I think a really fair point is that we could do better in posting interesting aspects to positive responses to
I agree with you there.
So
we got to wrap it up. So let me read the super chat real quick. Wesley, $5. Steve, do you have a blog or something similar discussing the logical problem with the lack of belief atheist position? I do have a blog, www.greatcommunity.com. I do 3 o'clock, what I call 3 a.m. philosophy, which is basically my rambling late at night when I'm dead ass tired, and everybody goes to read it and go,
see?
Yeah, I know it's one of those things that's hit or miss, man. I gotta admit, it's hit or miss. But the link is in the video description. You want to go check out that blog. I do want to have some editors with it, and some people that may want to write on that page. They're more than welcome to. I got more space on that domain than I'll ever use. So if people want to write some things for that, and I've been asked to write for a. Not Patheos, but something very similar. There's a new thing that's starting up, and somebody has actually asked me to write for them. Now I've considered that, so we'll see. But I still want to maintain my blog. But anyways, we got about 7 minutes before this ends, so we're going to wrap it up. I know we're going to probably be doing more on these maybe next couple weeks. But Tangel, am I pronouncing that right? Is it Tangel?
Tangel.
Okay. So, I appreciate, like I said, I really have a lot of respect for you that you actually went in there and did exactly what I said. Well, why don't you go ahead and do? And you did. I think that you do have a handle on these, and you are finding that
tenuous.
Trust me, it's epic compared to what I've had to the pushback that I've had over the years. And all my goal is, you've said what you want to take out of it. All my takeaway is that I want members of these communities to understand that their use of these terms are their usages because that's what they have stipulated them to be. That's not how I use these terms. That's not how the vast majority of the world uses these terms. You can't, and they cannot say, well, you're using these words incorrectly. You're strawmanning us. You're doing this. You're doing that. They're using all these logical fallacies that are incorrect. When all they need to do is really, if they solve all of this and say, look we have these words, we use them this way in our communities. We understand that other people use them differently, and we can look into why they do or why it's better or worse and argue that. That's fine. But I accept that the communities use these terms that way. I always have. This narrative that I've gone around and said, oh, well, you're not a true atheist. You're actually an agnostic, calling yourself an atheist. That's never happened. Okay, I don't go around doing that. And I know people in the atheist community that have said on stream before that that's what I do. And I can tell you right now that's something that I do not do. But yet I get every other day, well, Steve's an atheist, and it's like, well, they're not understanding, how I'm using these terminology. Now, if they say, look Steve, in our community, if you join our community, you would be an atheist. That's a fair thing, right? According to those usages, I most certainly would be an atheist. Nobody's ever argued otherwise for that. But I don't belong in those communities.
Yeah.
And I don't want to belong in those communities because I don't want to be beholden to any ideology, any agenda. I do my own thing. I want to say what I want, when I want, to whom I want, the way I want. And yes, sometimes it's not the best way to do it. I've learned a lot to modify my speech and according to who I'm talking to. But I just want them to acknowledge that the things I've been saying are not wrong. It's just different. There's a huge distinction to be made there because I'm lambasted by people saying, well, Steve's wrong, Steve's an idiot, Steve's, strawmanning atheism, and that's what I think causes contention.
Well, I think it's your fault. I think you're really bad at explaining your position.
That might be true. You might not have pushback on that from certain people. But to be honest with you, you've only seen a very small slice of me. I've spent
Sure.
I've been doing this for 6 years. I have hours of my own time with people in private conversations that I've talked about this topic. And so you probably could poll the audience, and I bet a lot of them would say I've explained to them very, very well. They've read my blogs. They've talked to me personally, both publicly and privately, and I bet they've changed their position or at least understand it much better now than they would have like 3 years ago. If you listen to the people talk about this topic 3-4 years ago, it was horrifying.
Yeah.
So, anyways,
Well, look,
what's your last words here?
You're not, so I understand that maybe you'd be less patient than I would be. But no, I see some points as valid, but I think Ozzy and I are more in tune with one another than possibly I am with you and Steve.
That's fair enough. Well, it's hard not to be in tune with Ozzy.
Yeah, very reasonable man.
I know. I'm waiting for that day where Ozzy loses his shit. Just completely loses it, man. It's going to happen. We're figuring out something that he just loses it.
I've almost got him there a couple times. I keep trying.
If anybody can, it's you. If anybody can, it's you.
I get plenty of... Bob Gray's had me pretty pissed off one time.
Yeah, he can be a little... I like Bob.
We're not buddies anymore, Bob and I.
He's an interesting character. I'll give him that. But anyways, let's wrap this up. So we got about 3 minutes. Hoyt, do you want to give a 30-second summation?
Yeah, really easy. I'm probably wrong more often than I am right. I don't have any problems being wrong. I think I'm wrong for the right reasons. I have problems dismissing other people dismissing people for no good reason at all. And I think that happens quite a bit more than what at least people should want it to in your particular community. But I'll stay a part of that community as long as we can foster dialogue. And again, my aim in being there is to ultimately do what Ozzy's saying we should do, which is better prepare people to have the conversations that need to be had, because you want to take people with you when you leave bad ideas. So that's why I'm there. So
I tell you what, well, I'll get a little takeaway from this. I will be a little nicer. Ozzy will be a little meaner. Hoyt, well, he's just going to do his thing.
If you want to fight, I'll fight. So, bring it if you in. So
I've tried different approaches before. There's Shannon asked me to go like a whole month without insulting somebody. Damn near killed me, but I did it. Okay, it was
I would challenge that you did it.
You think I missed it like 24 hours or something like that? And
a little more than that.
Okay, whatever. Well, and also,
I think we set the bar differently for what constitutes an insult.
Exactly. Our idea of insult vastly whirls apart, my friend. Vastly whirls apart. All right, so I'm going to end this. I want to thank everybody for the super chats and for joining. We had one last super chat. I'm going to read off from Urato is your muse. They say these are the discussions my brain craves. Thank you. And I agree with you. We're going to have a lot more of these types of discussions from many different topics, ranging from I got some astrophysicists coming on. I got some philosophers coming on. I've got some chemists that are coming on. We're booking for July. It's going to be, 2 or 3 days a week. I got a couple people that are going to be hosting this thing stuff with me, like Reg Rhetoric, Sarah Michelle, Cheshire, Nick Suter, and couple other people. So we got a lot of stuff in the works, and now that I got a computer that can actually stream without overheating, I can probably do more graphic stuff like this. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and like I said, we'll probably have part 2 on this at some time. But Tangel, thank you very much for coming in. And I was really impressed that you took a stand to actually try to explain this thing, because I guaranteed you're going to get pushback from this. And I don't want to see that pushback, but I know it's going to happen. But I tell you what, you got any problems, you just send them to me or Hoyt. We'll take care of them, okay? Good night.
Thanks very much. And nice to meet you.
Likewise. Very nice talking to you. Hope we do so again.